you mentioned Chase Edmonds and what that will do with the Cardinals. He also then factors into the team that we selected from the AFC East, and that is the Miami Dolphins. And the Dolphins are interesting in both the passing game and the running game. The big highlight headline addition is obviously Tyreek Hill and how that will work out with Jaylen Waddle being another one of the fastest wide receivers in the NFL, the clearest cut second year massive explosion guy, if we eliminate Chase because he's already become a superstar, how those two guys will work. And Tyreek Hill has been a quote machine for the Dolphins in the early going here. Still seems like he's got some hard feeling from the Chiefs trade. He's talked about how the Chiefs conspired to keep his receiving yardage down, which is kind of a hilarious note. He's mentioned that Tua is a more accurate deep ball thrower, which also kind of hilarious. I mean, Tua was very good at Alabama when he had guys getting wide open. And obviously the Miami Dolphins are going to try and create that environment again in Miami. The running backs, though, also very, very interesting. You mentioned Chase Edmonds. He is the most expensive in fantasy and should be, but there's this real traffic jam kind of behind him. And one of the things to start with is just simply, how does Edmonds work in? He's got this receiving profile that was very dynamic last season, and he was one of the guys that I drafted on that zero RB team. I was excited about it. One of the things that I noted there was that there were only 4 running backs in the NFL last year who had both a higher route percentage and a higher percentage of yards per route run. Right? All 4 of those guys are going in like the top 16 picks overall. The other thing that you have with Edmonds in terms of his ability to hit the hole, he tied for the lead in yards before contact last season. Now, a little bit of that is going to be how a back is used situationally. We know that James Conner took a lot of these short yardage runs where your expectation in that category is going to be much lower. But a lot of these guys who have this hybrid profile that is tilted toward the receiving element, they do have this explosiveness. It does come out in a way that helps them get those yardage numbers up. And he just seems like a very easy pick, and yet I find myself still having trouble with it, still a little bit skeptical, because you have Raheem Mostert, you have Sony Michel. Michel performed very well down the stretch last season. You look at the contracts for these guys, and it's clear that Edmonds is the sort of focal point, but you also have Myles Gaskin in there too, who has a little bit of overlap with him. And especially if last year's struggle for Gaskin was a little bit more the offense than, somehow his talent or skill level declining, you could have some competition there. So I think this running back group is difficult. And one of the things that throws even another wrench into the works, makes it very difficult to project, is the fact that Raheem Mostert is a huge question mark from an injury perspective. The Dolphins appear to be saying that they're hoping that he can be ready for training camp. When we're in the situation right now and teams have players who could play a big role, but they don't know if they're going to be healthy when training camp starts up, I mean, that's a pretty big red flag.
Yeah, the running back group there is very interesting, and interesting in relation, obviously, to their new head coach, Mike McDaniel, and how his offense will look. We sort of have to expect to some degree that it's going to look like the San Francisco offense. You can get into some trouble just being like, oh, it's going to be exactly like it. Who's the Debo in this offense? Who's the Kittle? Who's the Brandon Ayuk? How are the running backs going to be used exactly like San Francisco's used them? It's going to be different. There's different personnel there. But obviously, Mostert has some familiarity with the run schemes and the play calls and all of those things. That's definitely, unquestionable. And so you would expect, when healthy, that he's going to be involved in some capacity, probably as a change of pace guy, because, as you note, the health is a concern. Maybe he's only getting 5 touches a game. Who knows? And so Edmonds is really interesting in that regard. I'm with you. As you were talking through him, it feels a little bit like Singletary last year, and I guess even still this year, where it's this sort of uncertain backfield, and also a little bit uncertain how much backfield production will be there. And yet he's the lead back and probably a good player. And so how much do we question that at that price? You're probably, like you say, with the contract and everything, you're getting, even though it's uncertain what the role will be for Edmonds, you're going to get touches. Like we often talk about not calling any running back touches guaranteed touches, but at his price, I'm very comfortable saying that Chase Edmonds is going to get enough work to have plenty of scenarios to pay off that price. If healthy, he does seem like the guy, even though it's not clear how that will all split out, he does seem like the guy that does get work in almost every scenario. At the same time, I mean, Mostert and Michel are even much cheaper, and there are scenarios where those guys are 10 touch a game guys and reasonable 0 RB targets late. And so I think this is a really interesting backfield. But the one note you had on Edmonds specifically about how good of a receiver he's been, his routes and efficiency as a route runner on a per route basis being both strong and putting him in a class where very few backs are better in both cases on enough volume and more efficient on a per route basis, is interesting in the context of this offense, because the Niners didn't always throw to the backs a ton. And, as I just said, you get in trouble trying to say, oh, this guy's the new Debo. But when you look at the personnel, you look at Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, you have to think one of those guys is going to be involved around the line of scrimmage in some capacity, whether it's running the ball some or catching short passes or doing a lot in space that the Mike McDaniel offense will be designed in some way. You think about what is the strength of this offense, it's those two speedsters, right? And so what would Mike McDaniel do? Well, I mean, I think if he's smart, he's going to try to recreate what they've done in San Francisco in terms of generating yards after the catch, getting players in space. That's been a staple of the San Francisco offense for years is yards after the catch for basically anyone. Getting these guys using movement and misdirection in the run game to then create opportunities in the pass game. So the pass volume for the running backs is a little bit of a concern. As good as Edmonds is as a pass catcher, is Tyreek Hill going to eat into that? Is Jaylen Waddle going to eat into those short area targets?
And you mentioned this yards after the catch element. Both of those guys went over 400 yards total after the catch last season. Obviously, that's on heavy volume. They had 158 and 133 targets, respectively. Waddle targeted around the line of scrimmage, just 7.5 yards down the field. Tyreek Hill just over 10, which speaks to the interesting nature of his profile, because we know that he was actually targeted at and behind the line of scrimmage quite frequently, but also had a lot of those deep plays. Now, his racer last season, his ability to convert the air yards was only 0.76, which kind of gets back to this frustration that he had with how the Kansas City offense ran last year. But when you look at the share of the offenses, 27% for Tyreek Hill, 24% for Jaylen Waddle. How are you projecting these guys? How are you thinking about the projection for them early on? And do you think a third receiver like a Cedric Wilson will get involved, or is it just going to be very concentrated on these top two, knowing that Mike Gesicki also is going to be involved?
Right. And so the way that I'm thinking about it, and I haven't done the projection yet, but when I do my projections, basically anyone who does projections is doing them from the top down. You're going to set the team level volume and those types of things first. But when I get to the player level and sort of start allocating volume and thinking through that, one of the big things that's been clear to me over the last several years of doing it and the way that I want to approach it is I want to look at who the best players in the offense are first and make sure that I'm allocating enough volume for them, because teams aren't stupid. They're going to get the ball to the players that are very good. If you try too hard to be like, oh, I have to keep enough touches for the running backs, or I have to keep enough touches for this position or that position, then you're like, oh, well, it doesn't work. Like you just said, Tyreek Hill 27%, Waddle 24%. Obviously, in different offenses, if you're trying to keep some certain number set aside for the wide receiver 3 and for the tight ends and for the running backs and all those things, you're not going to get anywhere close to those numbers for the top 2 receivers in Miami. But I want to start saying, I don't think they're going to combine for 50% target share. That's a lot for 2 receivers. But I do want to start with them being close to that. I'm probably going to have to regress both those numbers, but that's the part where I don't see a lot of scenarios where those 2 guys don't get a lot of work, force-fed work, because they should, right? And then for me, it's a question of, okay, then how do I allocate the remaining stuff? Who is the next most important player to the offense? I think Chase Edmonds comes in quick after that point, and Mike Gesicki. And those are the 2 guys that I think Gesicki is a pretty clear number 3 in the offense. I don't know how that is going to look when I sit down and project and allocate stuff to Tyreek and Waddle and what is left for Gesicki, if it's more or less than he had last year. But I think he's pretty clearly the next guy, and Edmonds is pretty close to that. Then you have the other running backs do have to combine for a certain amount of rush volume, because I'm, excited about the Mike McDaniel offense, or aware of the Mike McDaniel's offense. Maybe not excited about it, but there's got to be rush volume. And maybe Edmonds isn't the guy that gets a ton of that. So it's Michel and it's Mostert and it's Edmonds some. And then for me, Cedric Wilson is probably the pretty clear next receiving option. But I do think it's going to be concentrated pretty heavily on Tyreek and Waddle, and that's where I would start from a projection standpoint. And then Wilson, I would suspect in my projection, will wind up being squeezed, because that's sort of how I expect their offense to go, with like a 1A, 1B, and then Gesicki as the clear 3, and then Wilson as the clear 4, if you will, of the non-running back receiving weapons, the best of the rest, right? But a tier below Gesicki in my mind.
And you mentioned Gesicki, and he's a wild card as well, especially from a fantasy perspective. I think very interesting, because when you look at his numbers, and I'm looking at the Stealing Signals tool on the site, which we obviously branded after your amazing newsletter. It's fueled by the Sports Info Solutions number, so keep that in mind when you're listening through to some of these specifics. His route percentage and targets per route are not up there with like the big 5, but they're in this very clear next tier that doesn't have necessarily a lot of guys. And you look at him and how he's performed from that perspective, it's kind of hard to match or understand within the context of his ADP. He looks like a very clear value, especially if this offense emerges, especially if he becomes this sort of George Kittle light type of player. And yet we do have some questions, I think, about his talent, but some of those may simply be that he flukily only scored 2 touchdowns last year. Are we seeing a guy here who is undervalued because he just didn't score enough points, and that obviously leaves a sour taste in the mouth? Or is it a situation where, I mean, Tyreek Hill really caps his upside? He no longer has the chance to be this like elite number 2.
I think the clear undercurrent is that if either Tyreek Hill or Jaylen Waddle misses some time, number one, the other of them becomes the focal point of the offense, based on the way that I just described it, based on my reading of the offense. The other, if Waddle's out, Tyreek is the focal point in those games. If Tyreek's out, Waddle. And then that also creates a lot of contingency value in Gesicki. So when you ask about, does Tyreek squeeze him too much, and is there not enough volume in the offense? That's the way I think some people will look at a projection for this team. I always like it when I feel pretty comfortable that player is above the additional options in the offense. Maybe I'm not super comfortable that he's like clearly ahead of Cedric Wilson in the case of a Tyreek Hill or Waddle injury, but I think he's definitely either on par with him or ahead. And then there's not really anyone else that I would be concerned about. And so, yes, from a projection standpoint, Gesicki's numbers may not look amazing, but that contingent value, I think, makes him a clear target for the reasons that you asked. If either of those top 2 receivers misses time, Gesicki's going to step into a pretty big role probably. And then even if they don't, they're going to attract a lot of attention. And there's that other element where like a projection might not show what you just described. If the offense takes off a little bit, Gesicki's going to come along as the third option. Again, in the reading of the offense that I have, that makes him a target. Like, you want the third option in an offense that has potential to move forward, or if one of the top 2 guys misses some time, then he has this contingent value. Feels like a small miss, big hit type of play. Absolutely.
And I like the way you put that. It's interesting because we did pick the under for the Dolphins in our previous show, looking at how the teams are being projected in terms of total wins. But in fantasy, all of these guys have prices that feel like there's some upside there, because with Tyreek Hill, you're getting him late in the second round when he's a first round talent type of player. If he is able to carry things over to the Dolphins, and like you said, if there are any injuries, then you can easily have that first round type of production. Jaylen Waddle going at the end of the 3rd, he has this second year leap potential and is priced in a way where there's this exploitable element where, especially if you think Waddle's going to be the number 1, then, I mean, you can get him at a full round discount for that if you're sort of 50-50 on how these players work out. And then Gesicki and then Edmonds, in both of those cases, again, we're getting very good prices on the potential for them to emerge and be the guys that they have been. The uncertainty is keeping those guys down a little bit. I'm not necessarily suggesting you want to have huge exposure. I don't have huge exposure, but those 4 individual players, very interesting. And then Michel in the last round also.
Yeah, I think you put that really well. The uncertainty definitely creates opportunity, but also maybe not guys that we want huge exposure to.